Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for joining today. And when one of you listening suggested that I do this story, that I talk about the story you're going to hear today, before I looked it up, I thought, Charles Whitman. I know who that guy is. And I immediately thought of, we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. So medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. That is from Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, not the person we're talking about today. Charles Whitman, Joe, you dummy. So that was my mistake, but you can see where I would get confused, right? If this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all the back episodes. Makes it super simple when you're a subscriber. You never miss any new ones as well. Connect with me on social media. See the visuals that we're talking about here on the podcast. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that's possible for ratings and reviews. Your positive feedback is appreciated. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things related to 10-Minute Murder. Now, to today's story. When Charles Whitman, armed with multiple firearms, terrorized the University of Texas Austin campus on the 1st of August, 1966, it seemed that his only goal was taking as many lives as possible. He had no vendetta against these people. He didn't even know them. What does it take for a seemingly ordinary young man to spend more than an hour shooting strangers on a university campus, killing 16 people? Charles was a smart boy with an IQ of 139 at the age of 6. His parents supported all of his academic achievements, but to Charles's father, any failure was unacceptable. If Charles didn't perform to his father's standards, he would be disciplined. His parents had married when his mother was only 17 years old, and she was abused throughout their marriage. The control that Charles's father exerted over his mother was clear to their children, who lived in fear of upsetting the fragile balance. From a young age, Charles desperately wanted to impress his father. He found another way to do that: firearms. Charles's dad was a gun enthusiast, a pro at shooting and taking care of weapons, and Charles began accompanying him on hunting trips. He showed a natural aptitude for firearms and was a talented marksman, which impressed his father greatly. This is the first piece of the puzzle. The love for guns and the natural talent for hitting targets from a distance followed Charles into adulthood. He went on to enlist in the United States Marine Corps, where his firearm skills earned him a sharpshooter's badge, although he never became a Marine Corps sniper. That day, at the University of Texas, a part of Charles was remembering the skills that he had first learned as a young child, while his father talked him through shooting and killing his first squirrel. From a distance, university students were just a target to Charles, like the ones he had shot in his Marine marksmanship tests. The UT Austin campus wasn't just some random target. In fact, this is where Charles had studied engineering in 1961, thanks to a scholarship with the Marines. It's also where he met Kathleen Leisner, known as Kathy, the woman who would become his wife 1 year later. However, Charles wasn't a great student, and the Marines canceled his scholarship due to his poor grades, ordering him to return to active duty the following year. The bad habits that Charles had engaged in at university, especially gambling, still plagued him, and he was no longer happy to be serving in the Marines. In late 1964, he was discharged and worked a series of temporary jobs. Shortly afterwards, something happened that put Charles under immense stress. His mother decided that she had had enough of her abusive marriage and wanted to divorce. Charles made every effort to help, terrified that his father's violence would escalate. Although Charles managed to help his mother get to safety, he started abusing amphetamines to help with the stressful situation. But only months after saving his mother from her abusive marriage, he would go on to brutally take her life himself. One day before the murders, Charles visited a hardware store where he purchased a knife and a pair of binoculars. Despite these sinister purchases, Charles's loved ones didn't see any signs of anything that was about to go terribly wrong. Just like normal, he picked Kathy up from work and then went out for lunch with his mother. Kathy had a shift beginning at 6 p.m., and while she went to work, Charles wrote a letter. Only days later, the letter would gain notoriety as the suicide note of a homicidal maniac, the Texas Tower Sniper. The note didn't have the confidence or the anger that usually oozes from the manifestos of mass shooters. Instead, Charles seemed to be doubting himself, saying, quote, "I don't really understand myself these days," and confessing that despite being an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man, he had recently been plagued by alarming, intrusive thoughts, which became harder and harder to ignore. These thoughts had gotten so distressing that it was difficult for Charles to function in day-to-day life, bringing him to the point of desperation that led him to writing the note. As well as the feeling like he was losing control of his own mind, Charles was distressed by almost constant headaches. This led him to writing an unusual request. He asked that his body be autopsied to see if there were any medical reasons for his change in behavior and worsening headaches. The note made it clear that Charles fully intended to murder his wife and his mother, but he wasn't even sure why he had decided to, even referring to his wife as, quote, "as fine a wife to me as any man could ever hope to have." He settled on a motive for their murders. By killing them, he would save both of those most important women in his life from any further suffering, and from the shame that would no doubt follow his next actions. Although this implied that he planned to commit more than just 2 murders and his own suicide, the note never directly mentioned a plan for the mass shooting. He did not wait to carry out his plan. Shortly after midnight, Charles arrived at his mother's apartment, killing her with a stab wound to the heart. He gently placed her lifeless body on top of her bed, wrapping it with bed sheets and placing another note next to it. Addressed to only "to whom it may concern," the note began, quote, "I have just taken my mother's life. I am very upset over having done it. However, I feel that if there is a heaven, she is definitely there now." Charles went on to apologize to the anonymous reader, assuring them that he loved this woman with all of his heart. Charles had now done something irreversible and might have felt as though he had no choice but to continue with the rest of his plan. Returning home to find his wife sleeping in their bed, he stabbed her in the chest. Just like he had done with his mother's body, he covered her with sheets. Then he edited his suicide note, writing in the margins that both of his intended victims were dead. He finished the note in a ballpoint pen, making a series of requests, including being cremated, his life insurance used to pay off debt, and that any remaining money be donated to mental health charities. Despite having killed his wife, he was concerned for the well-being of the couple's dog, asking for his wife's parents to take care of it. Early in the morning of August 1st, Charles made phone calls to both his wife's and his mother's workplaces, saying that they were sick and would not be coming into work. 6 hours later, he made his way to the University of Texas Austin campus, where he told the security guard that he was delivering research equipment. Then, his rampage began. Charles entered the university's clock tower, shooting and killing 3 people on his way up to the 28th floor. Once he was on the observation deck, he aimed his hunting rifle and began shooting indiscriminately at passers-by. He was actively shooting for a total of 96 minutes, using several weapons. During this time, he wounded 31 and killed 14. 2 more of the wounded would later die from their injuries. It's unclear whether Charles had planned to commit suicide by cop, but as he had intended, he died that day. His rampage was ended when 2 Austin police officers entered the top of the clock tower, and Patrolman Houston McCoy shot and killed Charles at the scene of the crime. The autopsy was carried out on August 2nd. Blood and urine were sampled after it was discovered that Charles had been prescribed Valium before his death, and he had also been abusing amphetamines. The toxicology, however, was not the most interesting part of the autopsy. The neuropathologist who performed the tests discovered that there was a tumor in Charles's brain. Although investigators could not say for sure that the tumor had led Charles to the massacre, it was possible that it had changed his behavior enough to make an ordinary man into a killer. They believed that the tumor was pressing against a part of the brain called the amygdala, which controls the fight or flight response of the body. With the amygdala compromised by the tumor, Charles might have experienced out-of-control emotions and a lack of rational thinking. He had no way of knowing that a brain tumor was growing inside his skull, taking away his ability to think reasonably and tormenting him with headaches. The tumor was a glioblastoma, a type of cancer with incredibly poor survival rates, even in 2023, let alone in the 1960s. Even before he committed the murders, Charles Whitman had been a dead man walking. That is your 10-minute murder story for today. Now, what I'm about to tell you about has nothing to do with the story that you just heard, even though it's about Austin. It's a complete coincidence, but it's something that I feel like I need to pass along to you. There is current information that there's something going on in Austin, Texas right now. I don't want to be all dramatic and sound the alarm that there's a serial killer out prowling around, but there's definitely something happening. People are going missing and being found drowned near Rainey Street. And that seems to be the primary point of origin. And it looks like it could be a group or team of people maybe doing this. No one really knows. And if the police know, they aren't saying at this point. If you live or visit Austin, until this gets figured out, it's advisable that you hang out in groups and absolutely not alone. Buy your own drinks and don't for any reason leave it unattended. I know it can be a nice gesture or an icebreaker if a stranger buys you a drink, but don't do it. Don't put your mouth on that thing. And don't go walking anywhere alone. Lady Bird Lake is where the bodies are being found. And the problem here is that many of these drownings are being ruled accidental, despite the fact that there appears to be blunt force trauma on some of the bodies. So there's really no way of knowing how many potential victims there are. But it's possibly over 20, approaching 30, and all of them are young male victims. So that is happening right now in Austin, Texas. It's been going on for the last few years, but it seems to be ramping up. So if you live in that area or plan to visit that area, please be careful.